The wind rolled low across the plains, dragging the scent of dust and distant rain through the fading light of evening. Caleb Turner stood alone beside a half-mended fence, his sleeves rolled up, rough hands gripping the hammer that had become more companion than tool over the years. The sky stretched endlessly above his ranch, painted in bruised purples and fading gold. The kind of sky that made a man feel both small and exposed. He had lived on this land long enough to read its moods. The warning in the air before a storm, the lonely hush before darkness settled in. But tonight, something felt different. It wasn't the weather. It was the stillness. He sensed her before he fully saw her. At the far edge of his property, near the old sycamore tree that marked the boundary between his land and the wild hills beyond, stood a tall figure dressed entirely in black. The fabric of her dress clung and rippled in the wind, moving like smoke around impossibly long limbs. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She simply stood there watching. Caleb lowered the hammer slowly. Out here, strangers were rare. Women wandering alone at dusk were rarer still. He wiped sweat from his brow and took a step forward, squinting against the wind. As he drew closer, the scale of her presence became undeniable. She was tall, nearly a head taller than him, and Caleb was not a small man. A dark veil covered her face, pinned beneath a wide-brimmed mourning hat. The black lace fluttered faintly, revealing only the shadow of her features beneath. "Ma'am?" he called out, voice steady but cautious. "You're a long way from town." She did not answer. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of lavender and rain. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but awareness. She wasn't lost. She wasn't confused. She was here for a reason. He stopped several feet away, keeping a respectful distance. "If you need help, you can say so." For a long moment, there was only the restless sigh of the plains. Then finally she moved. One gloved hand rose to clutch at the veil near her throat, fingers trembling slightly. When she spoke, her voice cut through the wind like a fragile blade. "I need to make love, don't move." The words hung between them, startling in their boldness. Caleb's muscles went rigid, not from anger or shock, but from the raw vulnerability laced through her tone. It wasn't a sultry whisper. It wasn't a demand of hunger. It was a breaking confession from someone standing at the edge of themselves. He studied her posture more carefully now. Though tall and striking, she wasn't towering in dominance. Her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of something heavier than the black fabric she wore. The veil trembled not from wind alone, but from uneven breaths. "You don't have to say it like that," Caleb replied quietly, his voice calm as steady earth. "You're not asking for a thing to be taken. You're asking not to be alone." Her head snapped up slightly, as if his words had reached a place she hadn't expected anyone to see. "They look at me," she said, voice quivering, "like I'm unnatural, like my grief makes me dangerous, like wanting touch after burying my husband makes me shameful." The wind picked up again, swirling dust around their boots. Caleb remembered the whispers. In town, the stories of the giant widow who lived beyond the hills, who rarely showed her face, whose height and silence made children stare and women clutch their shawls tighter. He had dismissed it all as small-town cruelty. Now the reality stood before him, breathing and shaking in the dusk. "How long?" he asked gently. 3 years, she answered. 3 years since anyone held me without fear, since anyone looked at me without pity. A storm rumbled in the distance, low and heavy. Caleb felt the first drop of rain kiss his cheek. She stepped closer, just a fraction, as if unsure her legs would carry her the full distance. "I thought if I said it boldly," she whispered, "if I made it sound like I wasn't begging, then maybe I wouldn't feel so small." Caleb's heart clenched. For all her height, she looked heartbreakingly fragile. He removed his hat slowly, deliberately, and set it on the fence post beside him. The simple gesture felt like laying down a barrier. He stepped forward until only a breath separated them. Through the veil, he could see the faint outline of her lips trembling. "You're not small," he said softly, "and you're not monstrous for wanting warmth." The first crack of thunder split the sky. Rain began to fall in earnest now, streaking down the veil and darkening the dust at their feet. She stood frozen, as if bracing for rejection, for disgust, for confirmation of every cruel glance she had endured. Caleb did something no one in town would have expected. He opened his arms, not in lust, not in surrender, but in invitation. The gesture was simple, honest, and unguarded. For a heartbeat, she did not move. Then the restraint she had carried for years broke. She stepped into him, her tall frame folding inward as if she had been waiting her whole life for permission to collapse. Her gloved hands clutched at his shirt, and he felt the tremor of her sob before he heard it. The sound was raw, torn from a place too long suppressed. He wrapped his arms around her firmly, anchoring her against the storm. She was taller, yes, but in that moment she felt weightless, like someone who had been holding themselves upright by sheer will alone. Rain soaked through his shirt and plastered her black dress against him, but he did not loosen his grip. "It's all right," he murmured near her ear, steady as the land beneath them. "You don't have to demand closeness here." Her forehead pressed against his shoulder, veil damp between them. The storm raged overhead, lightning flashing across the open sky, yet the world seemed to shrink to the space they occupied. She had come seeking passion out of desperation. What she found was stillness. Caleb held her until her shaking softened, until her breathing matched the slow rhythm of his own. The plains no longer felt empty. The storm no longer felt threatening. It felt cleansing. In the distance, thunder rolled away, leaving only the steady fall of rain. And there, in the middle of a wide, lonely ranch, a man who had grown used to silence chose to break it, not with grand promises or reckless desire, but with the quiet courage to hold someone who believed herself unholdable. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the storm had softened to a steady whisper against the roof, rain tracing silver lines down the windows. Caleb pushed the door open and guided her inside, the warmth of the small home wrapping around them like a second embrace. The scent of wood smoke and aged pine filled the air. It was not a grand house, but it was solid, steady, built with hands that believed in endurance more than decoration. She stood just inside the doorway for a moment, water pooling at her feet, black fabric clinging to her tall frame. The veil still shadowed her face, though now it seemed less like protection and more like habit. Caleb moved first, crossing to the hearth and kneeling to stir the embers back to life. Flames licked upward, casting golden light that softened the hard edges of the room. "Here, you can take that off," he said gently, glancing toward her veil. "You don't have to hide here." Her fingers hesitated at her chin before slowly lifting the lace away. When the fabric fell back, her face was revealed in the flicker of firelight. Strong lines, high cheekbones, eyes rimmed red from crying, but still bright with something fierce beneath the grief. She wasn't fragile in the way porcelain is fragile. She was fragile in the way a bridge is after carrying too much weight for too long. "My name is Ilara," she said, voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier urgency. "Caleb," he replied. He handed her a dry towel, then another, careful not to let his touch overwhelm her. She dried her face and hands, movements slow and deliberate, as if reacquainting herself with simple acts of care. The storm outside no longer felt violent. It felt like a backdrop to something unfolding gently within the walls. They sat at the small wooden table, the firelight dancing between them. For a moment neither spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was cautious, like two wounded animals recognizing safety, but not yet trusting it fully. "I thought if I was bold enough," Ilara admitted finally, staring at her folded hands, "if I made my needs sound like power instead of desperation, then I wouldn't feel ashamed." Caleb leaned back in his chair, studying her thoughtfully. "Shame grows in silence," he said. "You've been alone too long with yours." She looked up at him then, really looked at him as if measuring whether he pitied her. Whatever she saw must have reassured her, because her shoulders lowered slightly. "They stopped inviting me places after the funeral," she continued. "At first it was sympathy, then discomfort. I could see it in their eyes. A tall widow is a reminder of something they don't want to face, that love can end without warning. I became something ominous to them." "You became inconvenient," Caleb said quietly. "Grief makes people uncomfortable when it doesn't fade on schedule." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "You speak like you know." He did. He knew what it meant to bury both parents within a single harsh winter. He knew how the ranch had felt too wide, too quiet afterward. But tonight was not about recounting his losses. It was about understanding hers. She reached across the table hesitantly. Her fingers brushed his. The contact was tentative, a question rather than a claim. He turned his hand over, letting her palm rest against his. Her skin was cool from the rain, but steady now. "I don't want to command anyone ever again," she whispered. "I just didn't know how to ask." "You don't have to perform strength here," he replied. The room seemed to exhale with them. After a while, Caleb stood and lit a small oil lamp near the staircase. The house creaked softly, as if aware of the shift in its usual solitude. He extended his hand to her, not pulling, simply offering. "Come upstairs," he said. "You shouldn't face the night alone." She followed him, her tall silhouette brushing the low ceiling beams as they climbed. In the bedroom, the space was modest, a sturdy bed, a wooden dresser, a single window overlooking the dark plains. Nothing extravagant, nothing theatrical, just shelter. Ilara paused near the foot of the bed, uncertainty flickering across her face. The earlier boldness was gone, replaced with vulnerability so raw it felt sacred. Caleb stepped closer, but not into her space. "We go at your pace," he said firmly. "No demands, no performances." Her breath caught, and something inside her seemed to settle. He pulled back the blankets and sat on the edge of the bed first, removing his boots. She did the same, movements slower but more certain now. When they finally lay down, they remained fully clothed, facing one another beneath the soft lamplight. There was no urgency, no fevered desperation. Caleb reached out and brushed a damp strand of hair from her cheek. "Stay," he murmured, not as a command but as a promise. She shifted closer, resting her forehead lightly against his. The height difference that had once made her self-conscious now felt irrelevant in the quiet intimacy of shared breath. His arm wrapped around her waist, steady and protective without possession. For a long while they simply lay there. They spoke in low voices, about ordinary things at first, the stubbornness of ranch horses, the way her late husband used to hum off-key while fixing shutters, the smell of fresh rain on dry earth. Each story peeled back a layer of guardedness. Each shared memory stitched a fragile thread between them. Ilara's breathing grew slower, more even. Her hand curled into the fabric of his. Shirt, not out of desperation now, but comfort. He felt her tension ease inch by inch, like someone setting down a heavy load they had carried too far. "You didn't run," she whispered into the dim light. "You didn't have to chase," he replied softly. Outside, the storm drifted further into the distance, leaving only the rhythmic drip of water from the eaves. The world beyond the ranch remained the same, judgmental, narrow, whispering, but inside that small room, something radical had happened. She had asked for love, in the only language her loneliness knew, loud and defensive. He had answered in a different language entirely, quiet and steady. As sleep began to claim them, Caleb felt the subtle shift of her weight as she relaxed fully against him. Not towering, not monstrous. Just a woman finally allowed to rest. When dawn eventually crept through the window, pale gold spreading across the walls, it illuminated two figures who had not solved every ache of the past, but who had chosen not to carry those aches alone anymore. And sometimes that choice is the most shocking act of all.